Let me come forward to welcome you all to the third lecture on Satyarth Prakash. As we all know, Satyarth Prakash, authored by Maharshi Dayanand Saraswati in late 19th century India, occupies a seminal place in the history of modern Indian social and cultural reforms. It is not merely a religious treatise, nor simply a work of polemics. Rather, it is a comprehensive reformist manifesto aimed at moral regeneration, social justice, and cultural self respect. Written at a time when Indian society was burdened by internal stagnation and external colonial domination. Satyarth Prakash sought to diagnose the causes of decline and propose remedies rooted in reason, ethical discipline, and the original spirit of the Vedic tradition. Here we must know the intellectual context of Satyarth Prakash. The 19th century was a period of profound social churn in India. The whole nation and the society, or the Bharatiya society, was facing rigid caste system. Caste hierarchies were there, gender inequality, religious superstitions, decline of indigenous education, cultural inferiority induced by colonial narratives. Dayanand Saraswati responded not by rejecting tradition but by reclaiming and reformulating it. Satyarth Prakash emerged as a bold attempt to reinterpret Indian civilization through the twin lenses of Vedic authority and the rational inquiry. And the central reformative thirst of Satyarth Prakash is its call to return to the Vedas as the authentic foundation of Indian spiritual and social life. Dayananda argued that many social evils had arisen not from Vedic teachings but from later distortions, interpolations, and accretions. According to him, Vedas are the scriptures of true knowledge. Whatever is contrary to the Vedas is false. This appeal served multiple reformist purposes. It challenged superstition without rejecting indigenous roots. It restored confidence in India's intellectual heritage. It also proved a moral, scientific, and philosophical basis for reforms. It rejected blind traditionalism. It opposed uncritical Western imitation. Mrs. Annie Besant says Swami Dayananda was the first to proclaim India for Indians. I consider him a religious and social reformer. I have true respect for this great man. A.L. Basham, he says, I quote, the Arya Samaj founded by Dayanand Saraswati in 1875 is more nationalist and is still an important force in Uttar Pradesh and Punjab. The claim of its founder that all wisdom was to be found on Vedas was accompanied by an attack on worship of idols, an insistence on monotheism and social equality, and much educational activity. In this regard, W. Norman Brown, his view are also noteworthy. He says, a second reform movement is the Arya Samaj, founded by Dayanand Saraswati. He professed to restore the beliefs, ceremonies, and social instructions of the Vedic people, whose teachers he maintained were acquainted with all that modern science and technology have discovered and invented. The conclusion he supported by highly subjective interpretation of Vedic passages. He preached cow protection as part of his program. He vigorously combated with Islam and Christianity in India. Alan quotes Buckey Didi, who was a lecturer in the history and comparative study of religions, University of Cambridge. He says, I quote, for another line of development in Reformed or New Hinduism, we must go back to the year 1875, when Dayanand Saraswati founded an association which he called Arya Samaj. Arya Samaj has undertaken some praiseworthy, unselfish social service among the depressed classes and possesses good educational institutions. There is another fellow, a very famous Christian missionary, J.N. Farquhar. He says, I quote, it is evident from all that Pandit Dayanand Saraswati was a man of large views. He was a dreamer of splendid dreams. He had a vision of India purged of her superstitions, fitted for self rule, having a place on the sisterhood of nations, and restored to her ancient glory. Now we shall take a look of the work carried out by Maharshi Dayanand Saraswati in the sphere of social and cultural reforms. First of all, he launched a powerful critique against mechanical ritualism devoid of scientific and ethical content. Second one, idol worship or Murti Puja that undermined rational faith. Third one, exploitative priestcraft. He argued that religion should promote moral transformation, rational understanding, and social responsibility, not fear or blind obedience. This rationalist approach helped cultivate a spirit of inquiry and self respect among Indians. His observation about religion is, he says, those acts which do not promote knowledge, dharma, righteousness, and good of all are not worthy of being called religious. On idol worship or Murti Puja, he states unambiguously, according to him, God is formless, omnipresent, unborn, and infinite. The worship and to worship an image is to limit the infinite and contradict reason. This critique encouraged Indians to move from ritual religion to scientific and spiritual and ethical religion, emphasizing character over ceremony. India is first and foremost a spiritual nation, not a material one. In a country grounded in spirituality, the worship of material idols or murtis neither aligns with its character nor reflects its intrinsic temper. The critique of idolatry was not unique to Swami Dayananda. Even Adi Shankara denounced idolatry, Murti Puja, particularly in the context of countering Buddhist and Jain practices. It is essential to understand that Murti Puja or idol worship is a later development in Hinduism, a deviation from the original Vedic ethos. Srimad Bhagavad Gita in 18th chapter, where Sri Krishna states that considering a human being as God and engaging in idolatry or murti puja are forms of tamasic worship. Typically, idolaters or worshippers of human forms confine God to a specific idol or human form. They revere, failing to recognize the divinity that transcends these representations. Shankara, in the context of Bhagavad Gita, that 18th chapter, which is some 21st shloka is there, referring in that context, Shankara says, first of all, let me tell the shlok of Bhagavad Gita of 18th chapter. In that shlok, Sri Krishna says, Ekasmin karye saktam ahaitukam alpameva cha sattvarth vad alpam chatat tamasam udahritam. Its translation goes like this: that knowledge which is attached to a single effect, lacking reason, trivial and narrow in scope, such knowledge is declared to be tamasic, born of tamasa. In connection with the above mantra, Shankar himself critiques Murti Puja in his commentary while referring to Jains and Buddhists. For example, he quotes, Ekasmin karye देहे बहिवा प्रतिमादौ सक्तम एतावान एव आत्मा ईश्वरो वा न अतः परम अस्ति इति यथा नग्न क्षपणकादीनां शरीरानुवर्ती देह परिमाणो जीव ईश्वरो वा पाषाणाद आर्वा मात्र इति एवं एकस्मिन् कार्ये सक्तम. Meaning, being attached to a single object, whether body itself or something external to it or an idol. That is, holding the belief that this alone is the soul or God and nothing exists beyond this is as in the case of naked ascetics, kshapanakas, means naked monks of Jaina religion, who believe that soul or God is limited to the size of the body, or that God is nothing more than stone or wood. Such fixation on a single object is meant here. Yoga Vasisht, another famous text of Advaita Vedanta, which was revised and updated after Buddha's period, also repudiates the Murti Puja prevalent in the then Buddhism. It says that people who do Murti Puja are like small children who play with dolls. Some argue that Murti Puja serves as an initial stage of Brahmopasana, suggesting that once a person begins with idol worship, they eventually progresses to higher stages of spiritual realization. Yet, in practical life, such progression is rarely observed. Individuals who start with Murti Puja often remain confined to it throughout their lives. from birth to death without advancing to the deeper dimensions of meditation and self realization. This persistent attachment to external forms exposes the fallacy of such claims. Consequently, these arguments are not only philosophically unsound but also contrary to the very essence of Vedic thought and spiritual ethos. During the Vedic period, the focus was on upasana, meaning meditation or contemplation, and, and inner worship. Even the term puja originally denoted meditation, not external ritualistic worship we associate with it today. Likewise, the word Devalaya did not refer to a temple as we know it now. It signified an astronomical observatory. The term Deva symbolized celestial knowledge. Thus, a Devalaya was a center for the study of astronomy and cosmology, where seekers acquired knowledge of the universe. A case in point is Mahakal temple in Ujjain. This was never merely a shrine dedicated to a deity or Shivalinga. Ujjain historically was the Greenwich of ancient India, the prime meridian from which time and directions were determined across subcontinent and the whole world. Mahakal, literally meaning great time, symbolizes this role as the foremost center of temporal and cosmic calculation. The practice of Murti Puja, as it developed in later Indian religious traditions, was not originally indigenous to early Vedic India. Its artistic and conceptual roots can be historically traced to Hellenistic world, particularly ancient Greece. Greek sculpture underwent a significant evolution beginning around the 7th century BCE. Early archaic forms gradually gave way to increasingly naturalistic and dynamic representations, culminating in the classical and Hellenistic periods. Greek artists focused intentionally on the idealized human form, working primarily in marble and bronze. Iconic sculptures such as Chorus, the nude male youth, often representing nobility or a heroic ideals, exemplify this aesthetic. The prevalence of nudity in Greek sculpture reflects everyday social behavior of the people that they had not done invention of clothes. With the expansion of Greek influence following Alexander's campaigns, Hellenistic artistic traditions spread eastward into regions such as Gandhara, modern day Pakistan and Afghanistan. There, Greco-Roman artistic techniques merged with Buddhist religious themes, giving rise to the Gandhara school of sculpture. This school is renowned for producing some of the earliest anthropomorphic representations of the Buddha, characterized by realistic facial features, wavy hair, flowing drapery, and a distinctly Greco-Roman aesthetic. Monumental works such as Bamiyan Buddhas stand as prominent examples of this tradition. From Gandhara, this sculpture idiom gradually entered Mathura. In Mathura, however, the overt Greek influence was progressively diminished. Artists developed a more indigenous style that emphasized symbolic expression and spiritual presence rather than strict anatomical realism. These forms of Buddhist imagery were later adopted by Shwetambar and Sthanak Jain traditions and eventually found their way into emerging Hindu iconography. By the early medieval period, anthropomorphic representations of divine figures, Brahma, Vishnu, Mahesh, and various goddesses became widespread within Hindu practices. It was during this phase that Murti Puja became deeply institutionalized in popular religious life. Adi Shankara, keenly aware of the powerful appeal of images in attracting the masses towards Buddhism and Jainism, adopted a strategic approach while firmly upholding the Advaita doctrine of the formless, non-dual Brahman. He promoted installation of Shivalingas across India or at different places during his period. It is crucial to clarify that a Shivalinga is not a phallic symbol. It is often misunderstood. Shiva represents Brahman, the ultimate formless reality. The black stone of the Shivalinga signifies tamasa. Tamas means the inactive, invisible, unmanifested principle. Just as potential energy lies dormant before becoming active. Similarly, this whole Prakriti before creation remains inactive in equilibrium stage that is known as tamasa. Tama eva va idam sarvam agra asid. Brahman itself is unmoving, yet gives rise to the universe. As the Ishavasya Upanishad declares, Brahman moves all, yet remains unmoved. Tad ejati tannaijate. Similarly, in Vedic astronomy, the setting sun is associated with the Shiva, which explains the linga's black color. Dwadash Jyotirlingas, 12 in number, correspond to the rising sun across the 12 months, while the singular Shivalinga represents the setting sun, the solitary sun of darkness, in contrast to the 12 suns of daylight. Thus, the linga became symbolic rather than anthropomorphic, functioned as a mediating form, serving as a focal point for devotion without fully compromising the philosophical principle of Nirakar and formless. Thus, the historical development of Murti Puja reflects a complex process of cultural interaction, adaptation, and philosophical negotiation. It was neither a purely indigenous phenomenon nor a simple import, but rather the result of sustained dialogue between foreign artistic traditions and evolving Indian religious thought. Thus, Maharshi Dayananda's critique of idol worship is rooted in both historical and spiritual reasoning. Murti Puja, having been inherited from Buddhist and Jain practices, is neither of indigenous origin nor appropriate for a spiritually oriented nation. A spiritual nation like India should seek to cultivate inner realization, not external veneration of material forms. Supporters of idol worship often argue that when a deity's idol is installed in a temple, a ritual called prana pratishtha is performed, which according to them imbues the idol with a life. However, this notion is philosophically unsound. Consciousness cannot be transformed into matter, nor can matter be transformed into consciousness. while consciousness and matter may combine to form the human body. The resulting body is the greatest temple of the soul, far superior to any stone or metal idol. On this philosophical ground alone, Maharshi Dayananda criticized Murti Puja as a fundamental misunderstanding of the spiritual reality. There were also compelling historical reasons for his critique. Consider the case of Mahmud of Ghazni's invasions, particularly his attack on Gujarat. The Somnath temple was vandalized despite the priest's assurance that Bhagwan Somnath would protect the temple from invaders. Idols were destroyed, the temple looted, and the promised divine protection proved ineffective. Maharshi Dayananda used this example to emphasize that it is the brave people and their efforts, not idols installed through prana pratishtha, that safeguard the nation and uphold dharma. True protection and progress come from action and genuine efforts directed in the right direction, not from the worship of lifeless things or forms. One of the most radical contributions of Satyarth Prakash lies in its rejection of caste based on birth. Drawing upon Vedic principles, Maharshi Dayanand Saraswati asserted that Vedic society followed one system and not the caste system. One should be determined by character, gun, conduct, karma, and swabhav, sanskaras of education, moral, ethical, and spiritual values. No one is a Brahman, Kshatriya, Vaishya, or Shudra by birth. A person becomes so by qualities, actions, and swabhava. The same truth is emphasized in the Bhagavad Gita, where Krishna declares Chatur Varanyam Srishtam Maya Gunakarma Swabhavataha. God created four Varnas according to the qualities and actions inherent in them as sanskaras. Untouchability and hereditary privilege were condemned by Maharshi Dayananda as unvedic and socially destructive. He unequivocally condemns untouchability. He says to treat any human being as untouchable is against the Vedas, against justice, and against humanity. This critique laid intellectual groundwork for later movements advocating social equality and dignity of labor. Ideas of Maharshi Dayananda and principles were supported by Vedic passages. Maharshi Dayananda was a staunch supporter of cow protection. He criticized cow slaughter. As part of his program, he vigorously combated with Islam and Christianity in India. In his celebrated work, Gau Karunanidhi, Maharshi Dayananda presents compelling evidence demonstrating that a living cow is infinitely more valuable than a dead one. He provides statistical data showing that a living cow yields substantial benefits through its milk, curd, ghee, dung, and even urine, amounting to lakhs of rupees over its lifetime. In contrast, the utility of a dead cow is minimal, offering only a few thousand rupees at best. Through this, Maharshi vividly illustrated the practical wisdom of preserving life and nurturing living beings. rather than reducing them to mere material objects. It would not be out of context to note that, inspired by the treatise Gau Karuna Nidhi, one of the most powerful and organized cow protection movements in 19th century India was initiated and led by Arya Samaj. The movement originated in Lahore and gradually spread eastward, extending as far as Calcutta. During that period, the British colonial administration established a slaughterhouse at Muri Gram of Calcutta, primarily to meet the dietary requirements of British soldiers stationed in India, for whom meat consumption formed an integral part of daily sustenance. This development became a major catalyst for widespread public agitation. The intensity and the organized strength of the movement were such that deputy commissioners across various districts of India formally reported to colonial authorities that the agitation was being systematically launched and directed by the Arya Samajis. These official reports consistently acknowledged that the ideological foundation and motivating force of the movement was Go Karuna Nidhi, a work authored by their revered leader Pandit Dayanand Saraswati. The movement thus represents a significant instance in which a textual articulation of ethical and civilizational values was transformed into a mass social movement, exerting tangible pressure on colonial administrative structures and shaping public consciousness on issues of the culture, morality, and indigenous values. Overwhelmed by the intensity and spread of this unprecedented and fierce agitation, Lord Lansdowne, the then Governor General of India, was compelled to take serious cognizance of its potential political and social repercussions. He prepared a detailed report assessing the nature of the movement, its popular support, and its likely consequences for colonial governance, and forwarded it to the higher colonial authorities in England for deliberation. In response, the colonial administration issued a calculated directive. Slaughterhouses across country were henceforth to be staffed predominantly by Muslims. This policy was subsequently implemented on a wide scale. Thereafter, whenever Hindu communities protested against slaughter of cows, colonial authorities sought to deflect responsibility by spreading the narrative that British themselves were not involved in cow slaughter, but that Muslims were solely responsible for the practice. Historically, it is important to note that prior to this colonial intervention, Muslim communities in many regions had largely refrained from consuming beef, maintaining social harmony and cordial coexistence with their Hindu brethren. The deliberate restructuring of the slaughterhouse administration by the British thus became a tool to sow mistrust and antagonism between Hindus and Muslims, transforming a cultural and ethical concern into a communal fault line. A history bears witness this policy of colonial manipulation and divide and rule had far reaching consequences. The period witnessed some of the most intense Hindu Muslim riots, with the issue of cow slaughter emerging as a flashpoint for communal violence. What had earlier been a matter of ethical protest and cultural preservation was thus converted through colonial strategy into a source of enduring social discord. This episode stands as a stark reminder of how colonial governance exploited religious sensitivities to fracture indigenous unity, leaving behind legacies of conflict that extended well beyond the immediate historical moment. It is indeed a matter of profound regret that even after the passage of more than 150 years since Maharshi Dayanand Saraswati forcefully raised the issue of cow slaughter, a comprehensive and uniform prohibition has yet to be achieved. Despite sustained moral, cultural, and ethical appeals, justice for cow remains unrealized even today. The underscoring the continuing gap between this underscores the continuing gap between enlightened reformist vision and social political action. One of the prominent reform is advocacy of women's education and social dignity. Dayananda was far ahead of his time in advocating women's education and dignity. He regarded the oppression of women as a primary cause of social decay. He says, I quote, where women are honored, their knowledge flourishes. Where they are dishonored, all actions become fruitless. Manusmriti also says, Yatarnaryastu pujyante ramante tatra devata. Thus Maharshi Dayanand strongly supported women's right to education. He says women have equal right to education, knowledge, and the pursuit of truth. Satyarth Prakash strongly supports education of women, respect for women as moral and intellectual agents, opposition to practices such as child marriage. In fact, many anti-women ideas in Indian society were borrowed from Semitic religions, where women have historically been regarded primarily as objects of sensory pleasure. Western history, spanning over 2 millennia, often denied women a spiritual or social equality. For centuries, women were considered to have no soul. Even as late as 1960s, women were assigned only half the labor of men and were barred from independently opening up bank accounts in the West and USA. Similarly, in Islamic history, women's roles were severely restricted. They were often excluded from the places of worship, such as mosques. Even in modern times, the canonization of the figures like Mother Teresa took decades, reflecting persistent systematic biases. By contrast, the Vedic system upheld the equality of women and men. The divine was expressed through both gods and goddesses, with no hierarchical distinction between the two. In many cases, a woman's name would be cited before her husband's. Examples such as Uma Shankara, Lakshmi Narayana illustrate this practice. Women were not only respected but were integral participants in spiritual, social, and intellectual life. It is a land where Manusmriti says an Acharya is 10 times greater than Upadhyaya. A father is 100 times greater than Acharya. and mother is 1,000 times greater than a father. This reflects the profound reverence for women and nurturing role of women that is intrinsic to our cultural and spiritual heritage. This country, where Upanishad says, Matri Devo Bhava, Pitri Devo Bhava, Acharya Devo Bhava, Matriman, Pitriman, Acharyavan Purusho Vedaha. Thus, contemporary movements advocating for women's equality and empowerment, though highly relevant in Western contexts where such disparities existed, reflect values already intrinsic to Vedic philosophy and Indian civilization. The Vedic ethos recognized and celebrated the full dignity, spiritual capacity, and social role of women long before such discussions emerged elsewhere. Mr. W. Norman Brown says, Dayananda viewed women's education as essential for societal regeneration. His views significantly influenced reform movements promoting gender justice and educational reforms. Dayanand was the staunch supporter of education, but not education based upon Western ideas. He emphasized education rooted in moral discipline, scientific temper, rational inquiry, indigenous languages and texts. The ideas articulated in Satyarth Prakash inspired establishment of Gurukul-based and modern educational institutions, especially through the Arya Samaj and DAV movement, which blended traditional values with modern knowledge. According to Maharshi Dayanand, education is not merely the acquisition of knowledge, it is a transformative instrument that empowers an individual with cultural refinement, moral integrity, humanitarian values, a spiritual awareness, and mastery over senses. He emphasized this truth in the as or he emphasized this truth like this. He says, Shiksha tu ya शिक्षा तु सा यया सभ्यता धार्मिकता जितेन्द्रियत्वं प्राप्नुयात्. Education is that through which one attains civilizational values, righteousness and self-mastery. For Maharshi Dayananda, the purpose of education was holistic. It cultivates the intellect, strengthens character, nurtures ethical discernment, and guides a person towards spiritual and moral excellence, preparing them not only for worldly success but for life of profound inner fulfillment. In fact, Maharshi Dayananda's concept of education was deeply rooted in the Vedic worldview. According to the Vedic system, education was not merely an instrument for acquiring skills or earning a livelihood. It was a transformative force meant to shape the entire personality of a human being. The primary aim of education was Manushya Nirvana, the inner and outer refinement of an individual, so that one may evolve into a cultural, ethical, self-disciplined, and spiritually awakened being. This vision stands in sharp contrast to the modern educational paradigm, where almost all efforts are directed toward economic empowerment alone. Contemporary education largely measures success in terms of employability, income, and material achievement. While such objectives are not inherently wrong, they represent only a partial and incomplete vision of human development, focusing almost exclusively on external success while neglecting the near growth. That is why, even after so much emphasis on economic gains, there is a disparity between poor and richer. Poor persons are getting more poorer, and rich persons are getting more richer. In the Vedic age, education was holistic. It aimed at achieving both material prosperity and spiritual fulfillment. Along with the study of sciences, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, governance, equal emphasis was placed on moral values, self restraint, social responsibility, and spiritual inquiry. Education cultivated viveka, discernment, what is permanent, what is impermanent, vairagya, detachment, and jitendriyatva, control over senses, ensuring that material success did not lead to moral decay or spiritual emptiness. Thus, the difference between the two systems is profound. Modern education seeks to produce efficient workers, whereas Vedic education sought to produce enlightened human beings, individuals capable of harmonizing material progress with ethical conduct and spiritual wisdom. Maharshi Dayananda's educational philosophy reminds us that true education must uplift not only the economy, but also the character, consciousness, and civilization of society itself. Maharshi Dayanand also emphasized upon religious tolerance and ethical universalism. While critical of religious dogma, both within Hindu traditions and in other religions, Maharshi Dayanand upheld ethical universalism. He argued that truth is universal. Moral principles transcend sectarian boundaries. Dialogue should be based on reason and evidence. The truth, the fourth, fifth, and the eighth principle of Arya Samaj are the examples of it. Fourth principle says one should always be ready to accept truth and reject falsehood. One must act only in accordance with dharma, that is, after due reflection upon what is right, satya, or worth doing, and what is wrong, asatya, or unworthy of action. Similarly, the eighth principle says ignorance should be dispelled and knowledge should be promoted. This contributed to the emergence of a confident, reformist, religious outlook. In addition to this, Satyarth Prakash played a crucial role in restoring cultural self-confidence by asserting that intellectual and ethical superiority of reasoned Vedic thought. Dayananda challenged colonial stereotypes that portrayed Indian civilization as irrational or stagnant. This cultural reawakening later fed into nationalist consciousness and movements for self rule. Here it would not be an exaggeration to state that Satyarth Prakash served as a powerful intellectual instrument in India's struggle for freedom, and that Maharshi Dayananda himself was one of the famous architects of India's awakening against British colonial rule, long before the political movements of the 20th century gathered momentum. Maharshi Dayananda had ignited a revolution at the level of thought, self-respect, and the national consciousness. The impact of Satyarth Prakash was not confined to India alone. Historical accounts from Mauritius and other regions of the Indian diaspora reveal that the study of this work played a significant role in inspiring resistance against colonial domination. Wherever Indians read and reflected upon Satyarth Prakash, it awakened a deep sense of self worth, cultural pride, and national identity. As people engaged with the ideas of this text, they began to question the legitimacy of the foreign rule. They raised their voices against pradhinata, political, intellectual, and cultural subjugation, and recognized that slavery in any form was incompatible with human dignity. Satyarth Prakash told them that freedom is not merely a political condition but a moral and spiritual necessity rooted in self reliance, rational inquiry, and courage. Thus, the struggle for independence was not fueled by weapons alone, but by ideas that liberated the mind before liberating the land. By restoring confidence in India's civilizational wisdom and encouraging fearless criticism of injustice, Maharshi Dayanand and Satyarth Prakash laid the ideological foundation upon which the edifice of the freedom was eventually built. One of the high profile reformers of the 19th century India, Maharshi Dayanand gave directions even about the reforms, how the reforms should take place. And his message was reform through internal critique, not imitation. Unlike some reformers who relied heavily on Western models, Maharshi Dayanand sought internal reform through indigenous categories. In 19th and 20th centuries, many of India's social reformers and leading political thinkers held a common belief that the nation's progress and reformation could only be achieved by emulating the West. They assumed that Western models of governance, education, and social organization were the benchmarks for modernization and liberation. Maharshi Dayanand Saraswati, however, stood apart from his contemporaries by nearly 2 centuries in his vision and understanding. He argued that true reformation and genuine freedom could not be imported or borrowed. They had to be culturally rooted, intellectually authentic, and socially sustainable. According to him, any lasting transformation must emerge from within through India's own traditions, philosophies, and indigenous frameworks. External imitation, no matter how sophisticated, could only produce superficial and short lived changes. This distinction marks the profound difference between the two approaches. Reforms that arise organically, grounded in the society's own cultural and intellectual foundations, are resilient. They endure through generations, adapting and thriving. In contrast, reforms that are imposed externally or blindly copied from another culture tend to be ephemeral, failing to resonate with the people and the fading with time. Maharshi Dayananda's advocacy therefore, was not merely for change, but for sustainable, self reliant, and deeply meaningful reform. He envisioned a society where progress is not a mimicry of the foreign models, but a manifestation of India's own wisdom and values, a transformation that is authentic, enduring, and truly emancipatory. It is interesting to note that the ideas of Satyarth Prakash found organizational expression in the Arya Samaj, which promoted education, fought social discrimination, repudiated child marriage, encouraged widow remarriage, opposed social evils through peaceful reform, raised voice against social injustice and criticism of untouchability, stood against proselytization, imbued self confidence in our own culture. The text thus moved from theory to practice. The famous Christian missionary J.N. Farquhar, he comments, I quote, turning to the social sphere, he, that is Maharshi Dayanand Saraswati, repudiated child marriage and insisted on education for girls as well as boys, outcasts as well as high castes. He attempted to introduce a kind of temporary marriage called niyoga to alleviate the life of misery and make a good destiny for the widows. There is another thinker, Valentine Chirol. Again, in the treatment of untouchable, low castes, the Arya Samaj may claim to have been the first native body to break new ground and to attempt something akin to the work of social reclamation of which Christianity and, in a lesser degree, Islam had hitherto had the monopoly. Although Valentine Chirol and other scholars have argued that religions like Christianity and Islam played significant roles in social reclamation and reform, particularly where they held a monopoly. This view overlooks persistent social hierarchies within these very communities. In India, for example, the legacy of untouchability and the caste discrimination continues even among Christians and Muslims. Within the Christian communities, there exist churches designated for lower caste Christians, often referred to as pariah churches. Members of high caste Christian groups never allowed to low caste Christians entry into their churches. Similarly, Muslim communities are not immune to the social stratification. They exhibit internal hierarchies and sect based divisions where notions of social superiority and inferiority persist. Although Christianity and Islam have often claimed that their religious frameworks are free from caste distinctions and untouchability, such assertions were historically advanced, at least in part, to attract a large number of socially marginalized and so-called low-caste Hindus into their fold. On the basis of these claims, converts were assured that they would escape social discrimination and enjoy full equality within these religious communities. It was precisely this assertion of social equality that shaped early policy decisions in independent India. The government of India initially restricted reservations to deprived sections within Hindu society on the reasoning that Muslims and Christians, by virtue of their religious doctrines, did not suffer from caste based discrimination. So, converts to Islam and Christianity were officially presumed to have left behind social injustice along with their reformer along with their former religious identity. However, historical experience and sociological evidence have demonstrated that this assumption was deeply flawed. In practice, entrenched forms of caste like hierarchies and social stratification continue to operate within both Christianity and Islam in the Indian context. Distinctions based on birth, lineage, occupation, and social status persisted, often mirroring the very caste divisions those religions publicly denounced. Dalit Christians and Pasmanda Muslims, for example, have long faced exclusion, discrimination, and denial of equal social and religious participation. In recent decades, this reality has become increasingly visible. Marginalized groups within Muslim and Christian communities have begun to raise their voices, demanding recognition of historical injustice and seeking access to reservation benefits. Their demands underscore a crucial truth: conversion did not automatically erase social inequality, nor did it guarantee dignity and equal opportunity. This unfolding situation exposes a fundamental contradiction between theological claims and social realities. The assertion that certain religions are inherently immune to social hierarchy and discrimination has proved to be more rhetorical than factual. The continued struggles of deprived Muslims and Christians reveal their social injustice is not resolved merely by changing religious labels, but requires honest acknowledgement, structural reform, and genuine commitment to social equality. This underscores a fundamental point: social discrimination, whether in the form of casteism, sectarianism, or racial prejudice, is a cross cultural phenomenon. No society or religion is entirely immune. Where one form of exclusion is absent, another often emerges, manifesting as racism, ethnic hierarchy, or class based oppression. It is in this context that Maharshi Dayanand Saraswati's vision stands out as truly revolutionary. He was among a few leaders in Indian history to explicitly advocate for social justice, equality, and eradication of entrenched hierarchies, insisting that true reform must address these inequalities at their roots. His approach was not merely about superficial legal or ritual changes, but aimed at cultivating a society founded on fairness, merit, and universal human dignity. Later, Mahatma Gandhi, imitating Maharshi Dayananda Saraswati, tried to eradicate untouchability from India, and he made efforts to address it. One of his most notable initiatives was to rename the scheduled caste and scheduled tribes as Harijan, meaning the people of God, with the intention of elevating their social dignity and removing the stigma associated with untouchability. However, this approach, though well intentioned, lacked a comprehensive, permanent, and systematic program for true social transformation. It focused primarily on symbolic change, altering nomenclature without addressing the underlying structures, attitudes, and cultural practices that sustained social hierarchy. Swami Shraddhananda, a visionary contemporary of Gandhi, recognized this limitation. When he met Gandhiji, he warned that simply changing a name could not alter entrenched social realities. He argued, Mahatmaji, renaming scheduled caste as Harijan will not transform their social status. Today they are discriminated against as scheduled caste. Tomorrow similar prejudice will attach to the term Harijan. Regretfully, Swami Shraddhananda's prediction proved correct. Over time, when the term Harijan came to be associated with social inferiority and stigma, failing to eradicate discrimination or challenge the hierarchical mindset embedded in society, the initiative did not address the structural roots of social injustice, the deep seated beliefs, customs, and power dynamics that perpetuate inequality. In contrast, a truly scientific and sustainable approach to social reform requires engagement with both cultural norms and institutional structures. Superficial or symbolic measures, no matter how well meaning, cannot eliminate social hierarchy or create lasting equality. Maharshi Dayanand Saraswati had foreseen this centuries earlier. Meaningful reform must be internal, systematic, and rooted in education, ethical consciousness, and indigenous values, rather than mere renaming or external adjustments. Thus, Gandhi's Harijan initiative, while morally admirable, ultimately highlights a crucial lesson in social reform. True emancipation cannot be achieved through symbolism alone. It demands persistent structural change, cultural reorientation, and a vision that is both pragmatic and enduring. It is often said that imitators, no matter how diligent, can never achieve the profound depth of insight and foresight possessed by the true visionaries. They may replicate actions or adopt superficial measures, but they cannot grasp the underlying principles, anticipate long term consequences, or create enduring solutions. This very phenomenon played out in the social reform efforts of the modern India. While well meaning leaders attempted to emulate reformist ideas, their efforts lacked the depth, rigor, and systematic understanding that distinguished the work of visionaries like Maharshi Dayananda Saraswati. The result was that symbolic or partial reforms, however popular or widely publicized, fell short of transforming society at its roots. In scientific and sociological terms, Maharshi Dayananda recognized the structural and systematic nature of social inequality. He understood that reforms that do not engage with deep rooted social categories and cultural practices are inherently fragile. Only through an internal indigenous effort to restructure society could lasting equality be achieved. It is important to note that Satyarth Prakash, although remained very controversial, its sharp critiques provoked resistance among orthodox groups and other religious traditions. However, these controversies themselves fostered public debate, intellectual engagement, and reformist discourse. Due to the failure of following guidelines, directions given by Swami Dayanand Saraswati in Satyarth Prakash. Till date, India is facing problem, and today also we are undergoing turmoils of various kinds. Lastly, I would like to conclude. Satyarth Prakash stands as a landmark in India's social and cultural reform movement. It combined moral courage, rational inquiry, scientific attitude, and civilizational confidence to challenge social injustice, and cultural stagnation. Its enduring relevance lies in its central message. And what is that central message? True reform arises not from blind imitation or destructive rejection of tradition, but from enlightened reinterpretation rooted in truth, reason, and ethical responsibility. For students of Indian history and social thought, Satyarth Prakash remains not only a historical document but a living resource of the reformist inspiration. Thank you.